Colonel stopped talking mid-sentence when he saw the coin around my neck, and for a second the whole reception hall, the clinking glasses, the folding chairs, the cheap banquet wine, just dropped away from him like he'd forgotten where he was standing. He was holding a plate of dried chicken in one hand. He didn't put it down so much as forget he was holding it. His eyes had gone to the little brass disc resting against my collarbone, and they stayed there. "Where did you get that?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the voice of a man who already knew the answer was impossible. I almost laughed because it was just my grandmother's old coin. I'd had it cleaned and put on a chain after the funeral, so I'd stopped misplacing it. But he wasn't smiling, and a man like that, 80 if he was a day, ramrod straight, a row of faded ribbons on his blazer, does not look at a thrift store trinket the way he was looking at this. "It was my grandmother's," I said. "She passed in the spring." He set the plate down then. Carefully, both hands, like it might go off. "What was her name?" That was the moment I started to understand the woman my own family had let die alone in a county hospital. The woman my mother called a sad case might have been someone I never actually met. My grandmother was the quietest person I have ever known, and I say that as somebody who spent 11 years in the army learning how to read people fast. She lived her whole life in the same narrow row house in a worn-out steel town outside Pittsburgh, the kind of place where the mills closed before I was born and never came back, cracked sidewalk, a maple tree out front that dropped helicopter seeds all over her tiny porch every May. She kept the porch swept anyway. She always kept things swept. She didn't talk about her past. If you asked, she'd tilt her head and say, "Oh, that was a different girl a long time ago." And then she'd ask if you wanted more coffee. She drank it black, out of the same chipped white mug for as long as I knew her. No medals on the wall. No flag, no shadow box, nothing. Just a few framed photographs of family and a needlepoint of a wren she'd done herself. To my mother, she was an embarrassment. I want to be honest about that because it took me a long time to be honest about it. My mother grew up wanting more than that row house could give, and she got it. She married a man with a good job. She lived in a 4-bedroom colonial with a Lexus in the garage, and somewhere along the way she decided her own mother's smallness was a kind of failure. She could catch like a cold. She measured everybody by what they had. My grandmother had almost nothing, so my mother decided she was almost nothing. When the call started, the falls, the confusion, the day a neighbor found her sitting on the porch step in February without a coat, my mother said the things people say. She's stubborn. She won't accept help. She chose to live like that. She said it the way you'd talk about somebody you read about in the paper. I was the one who got the call from the hospital because I was the one who'd left my number with the neighbor years ago. I was on rotation at Fort Campbell. I requested emergency leave that night and drove 8 hours straight up I-65 and the turnpike with the radio off the whole way. By the time I got there, she was already going. Pneumonia on top of everything else. There were tubes and a monitor beeping somewhere behind her head, and the room smelled like industrial cleaner and the inside of a thermos. She was so small in that bed. She'd always been small, but the bed made it obscene. She knew me, though. Her eyes found mine, and something in her face eased. "There's my girl," she said. Her voice was just air. "You came." "Of course I came. Mom and Dad are on their way," I told her, which was a lie because I called them from a gas station outside Columbus and my mother had said she'd see what she could do about the schedule. My grandmother smiled like she knew it was a lie and forgave me for telling it. "They won't," she said. "It's all right. It was always going to be like this." She squeezed my hand with what strength she had left, which wasn't much. "You were the one who sat still long enough to keep me company. That counts more than people know." Those were close to the last clear words she ever said to me. She slipped under that night and didn't really come back up. She died 2 days later, just before dawn, between one breath and the next, with me asleep in the vinyl chair beside her and no one else in the world aware it was happening. When I called my mother, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Well, at least it's over now. She's not suffering." And then she asked if I knew whether there was a will, because she didn't want to deal with probate. Nobody offered to plan the funeral, so I planned the funeral. I paid for it on my own card, a modest casket, a plot in the same Catholic cemetery where her parents were buried, a priest who'd never met her reading from a card I filled out. It came to a little over $9,000, and I didn't tell anyone that number, because I knew exactly what my mother would say about it. 6 people came. Me, the neighbor who'd found her, a woman from her church, the mailman of all people who'd retired but heard and came in his good jacket, and, near the end, an old man with a cane who stood at the back and left before I could ask who he was. My parents didn't come. My brother sent a text that said, "Sorry sis, crazy week at work, we'll send flowers," and then didn't send flowers. I stood by the open grave in my dress uniform and listened to the dirt come down, and I felt something turn over in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Not anger. Grief, sure. But underneath the grief was a low, cold question I couldn't shape into words. How did a whole life come to this? 6 people and a card with a wrong middle name on it. Afterward, I went back to the house to clean it out, because no one else was going to. It was the saddest 2 days of my life, and I'd had some sad ones. Her whole world fit in that little house, and most of it was the ordinary residue of a careful, frugal person. Stacks of rinsed yogurt containers she used for leftovers, coupons clipped and rubber-banded by category, a coat from probably 1985 with the buttons sewed back on by hand. She'd been living on Social Security and not much else, and she'd been doing it without complaining to a soul. In the top drawer of her dresser, under a folded slip and a sachet that had long since lost its smell, I found the coin. It was a brass disc, maybe the size of a 50-cent piece, worn smooth on the edges from decades of being carried. On one side was the figure of a small owl, very simply cut, the kind of thing you'd almost mistake for a hobbyist's work. On the other side was a string of numbers and one symbol I didn't recognize. Not a letter, not a date, something between a knot and a key. I'd seen her with it my whole life. She kept it in her coat pocket and worried it with her thumb the way some people work a rosary. Once when I was maybe 9, I asked her what it was and she closed her hand around it and said, "It's just a reminder." So I remember I was there. I didn't ask there where, because I was 9 and she'd already changed the subject. I kept it, not because I thought it was worth anything, because it was the thing her thumb knew best. My mother never asked about it. My parents had the house listed within 3 weeks and sold it in a month to a young couple who planned to flip it. My father said, "No sense letting it sit empty," and that was the last anyone in my family said about the place where my grandmother had lived for 60 years. I went back to Kentucky. I tried to fold the whole thing up and put it away the way you're trained to compartmentalize, and for a while it worked. But the question kept surfacing at odd hours. I knew almost nothing about her early life. I knew she'd grown up poor in West Virginia, that she'd worked for the government in Washington during the war, that she'd married my grandfather in 1949 and he'd died of a heart attack when my mother was a teenager. That was the entire official record of a person as far as my family was concerned. Worked for the government during the war. Filing, my mother always assumed, a typing pool. She licked stamps in some office, my mother said once, and laughed. A few months later, my unit got an invitation that went out to area service members and veterans, a regional ceremony, the dedication of a new wing at a military heritage museum a couple hours from base. There'd be speeches, a ribbon, retired brass, the works. I almost didn't go. I went because a buddy was going and because I'd just been promoted and figured I should start showing my face at these things. I wore the coin. I'd taken to wearing it under my blouse on a thin chain, just because leaving it in a drawer felt wrong. That night it had worked its way up over my collar, without my noticing. And that's how I ended up standing under a banner with a paper cup of bad wine in my hand, while a colonel I'd never met stared at my grandmother's coin like he was watching the dead walk. What was her name? He said again very low after I'd told him it was hers. Margaret Ellison, I said. Everybody called her Peg. I watched something move behind his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. He swallowed once, and when he spoke his voice had gone formal and careful, the voice of a man choosing each word like it might be evidence later. Would you walk with me a moment, Captain? Away from the room. We stepped out into a service corridor where the noise of the reception flattened to a hum. He stood there a second, collecting himself, an old man with very straight shoulders, and then he asked me to tell him exactly where the coin had come from, who'd had it before me, whether anyone else had ever seen it. I told him. The drawer. The handkerchief. The thumb-worn edges. He listened the way I'd been trained to listen, taking it all in, giving nothing back. I need to be careful what I say to you, he said finally, because most of it I'm still not cleared to say, and I'm too old to start breaking faith now. But I can tell you that your grandmother did not lick stamps. He almost smiled when he said it. And there was something terrible in the almost smile. Do you know what Arlington Hall was? I said I didn't. It was a girls' school in Virginia, until the army took it over in 1942. After that, it was where we read The Enemy's Mail. He let that sit. There were a few thousand people working there during the war, and most of them were women. And most of those women never told their husbands or their children one true word about what they did, because they signed an oath that said they wouldn't, and they kept it. Some of them kept it to the grave. He looked at the coin again. A very small number of them stayed on. The work didn't stop in 1945. The other side just changed. We needed people who could do a particular kind of thing. See the pattern in noise, hold an enormous amount in their heads, and never ever talk. Those people were not decorated. They could not be. Decorating them would have meant admitting the work existed. And the coin, I said, internal. His jaw worked. Not official. Nothing about your grandmother was ever official, you understand. That was the point of her. The coin was something a handful of people in one section made for themselves, quietly, the way men in a foxhole carve their names. It marked you as one of the ones who'd been inside the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. I haven't seen one in 50 years. I assumed they'd all been destroyed. I assumed the people who carried them had been. My ears were ringing a little. I was thinking about a woman in a chipped white mug and a coat from 1985. You knew her, I said. No. He shook his head slowly. I knew of her section. I came up after, in the agency that grew out of all this. But I knew the marking the second I saw it, the way you'd know your own father's handwriting. And I'll tell you what I felt, standing in there. His voice dropped. I felt ashamed, because somewhere in this country a woman who did work that men like me built whole careers on top of died in a way that her own granddaughter is wearing on a chain because there was nothing else left of her. He gave me a card with a name and a number on it. He said if I wanted to understand who she'd been, he could put me in touch with people, not records. The records would never come, but people, the few still living who'd been in the room. Then he straightened, the soldier coming back over him like a coat, and he said, Your grandmother was one of the quiet ones who held the line, so the rest of us could sleep. I'm sorry no one ever told you. Somebody should have told you a long time ago. I drove back to base that night with the coin in my fist the whole way. The metal had never felt heavier. The little owl, the numbers, the knot that wasn't a knot. I'd carried it for months thinking it was a keepsake. It was a fingerprint. I called my mother the next evening. I tried to keep my voice level. Do you remember Grandma's old coin? I asked. The little brass one she kept in her pocket. A pause. The lucky penny thing, vaguely. Why? It's not a penny. A colonel recognized it at a ceremony. Mom, she worked in intelligence during the war. Code breaking. Real code breaking. And after the war too. My mother actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh. That was almost the worst part. It was a tired, indulgent laugh. The kind you give a child who's announced they're going to be an astronaut. Honey, she said, your grandmother answered phones for the government and then she came home and married Grandpa, and that was that. She used to tell me she'd done something important to make herself feel better about how things turned out for her. People do that. Don't go building her into something. She'd have loved that, you making her a spy. She always wanted to be more than she was. She didn't tell you because she wasn't allowed to, I said. She wasn't allowed to tell her own daughter she licked stamps. My mother sighed. Sweetheart, you're grieving. I get it. But I knew her my whole life. I think I'd know. That's the line that stayed with me. I think I'd know. As though knowing someone your whole life is the same as letting them be known. My father was worse. In the flat way, he was always worse. When I brought it up that weekend, he set down his fork and said, your grandmother was a difficult, secretive woman who made your mother's childhood smaller than it needed to be, and now we're going to make her a hero. He shook his head. I'm not going to argue with a captain. But I knew that woman 30 years, and there was nothing there. A locked-up little person who never let anybody in. Whatever she's got you chasing, it's a story she told herself. I wanted to say a locked-up little person who never let anybody in is exactly what they would have manufactured if they'd set out to build one on purpose. But I didn't say it. I'd learned by then that there are people you cannot hand the truth to because they'd have to set down too much of who they think they are in order to take it. So I did what I do. I started pulling threads. I called the number on the colonel's card. He was as good as his word. Over the next several weeks, he connected me, carefully, with two people. One was the man who'd worked alongside the agency's old-timers and could speak only in the most general terms, hedging every sentence. The other was a woman. Her name was Vivian Marsh, and she was 91 years old, and she lived in a senior community outside Richmond with a view of a man-made pond. The colonel arranged for me to visit. I drove down in civilian clothes. She was waiting in the lobby in a cardigan with a wren pin on the lapel, and when I walked in, she looked at my face for a long time before she said anything. You've got Peg's chin, she said, and her way of standing like you're guarding a door. I sat with Vivian Marsh for 4 hours. She'd been at Arlington Hall as a 19-year-old, recruited out of a Virginia teachers' college because she was good at crossword puzzles and could keep her mouth shut. Those, she said, were the actual qualifications. She and my grandmother had come up together. She talked about the heat in those buildings in the summer, the all-night shifts, the way the work could make your hand shake when you finally cracked something open and understood what you were looking at. Convoy positions, a date, names. We never saw the ships, she said. We never saw the men. We saw 5-digit groups on a page, but we knew. You'd break a message and you'd know that somewhere out there a thing was going to happen or not happen because of what was on the page in front of you. And then you'd go to the mess and eat a sandwich and never say a word about it to anybody. Not then. Not for 60 years. She told me my grandmother had been one of the very best. Peg could hold more in her head than anyone in our section. She'd see the shape of a thing before the rest of us had it half typed out. They kept her on after the war, when most of us went home and got married. The work she did then I can't tell you about, and not because I'm being coy, dear, because she never told me either. We'd write each other for decades, and there were whole years she just wasn't anywhere. She'd surface again and we'd never speak of it. Vivian's eyes filled. I knew about your grandfather dying. I knew when your mother was born. I knew Peg was struggling, money-wise, all those years, and proud about it, and wouldn't take a dime from anybody. What I never understood was why a woman who gave the government the best years of her life ended up scraping by on a fixed income in a falling-down house with a family who thought she was nobody. She reached over and took my hand. Her grip was stronger than I expected. It cost her, Vivian said. All of it. You can't carry that much silence for a lifetime and have it cost you nothing. The secrecy ate the marriage a little. It ate the closeness she might have had with your mother. She couldn't explain why she disappeared, why she was the way she was, so people filled in the blank themselves, and what they filled it in with was small, selfish, cold. She let them think it. It was easier than the alternative, and the oath didn't have an expiration date she trusted. She squeezed again. And here's the part I want you to carry out of this room, because nobody told her, and somebody ought to tell you. She did not regret it. We talked about that once, near the end, on the phone. She said the only thing she regretted was what it took from the people who loved her, the ones who got the locked door and never the woman behind it. She didn't regret the silence. She regretted the cost of it. There's a difference, and she was very clear about it. Before I left, Vivian gave me a shoebox. Inside were letters, decades of them, my grandmother's handwriting on cheap stationery, postmarked from that worn-out steel town. Birthday cards, a photograph of two young women in shirtwaist dresses, squinting into the sun on a lawn in Virginia in 1944, arms around each other, one of them unmistakably my grandmother at 20, laughing at something just out of frame. I'd never in my life seen her laugh like that. She'd want you to have those, Vivian said. You're the one who sat still long enough. I had to go sit in my car for a while before I could drive. I went back to my parents one more time. I told myself I wasn't going to make it a confrontation, and then I made it a confrontation because I'm my grandmother's granddaughter. And there's a point past which I can't keep the door shut either. I put it all on the kitchen table. The coin. A photocopy of the photograph from 1944. A page where the colonel had written in his own hand a careful sentence confirming that the marking on the coin originated with a signals intelligence section and his signature beneath it and his title. I'd asked him for that, and he'd given it to me without hesitation, which told me something about what he thought we owed her. My mother looked at the photograph for a long time, the young woman laughing on the lawn. I watched her try to make it fit the mother she remembered and fail. This doesn't look like her, she said quietly. It's exactly her, I said. It's her before all of you decided who she was. My father read the colonel's note twice, and his hands weren't steady the second time. This is real, he said. It wasn't a question either by the end. It's real. There are people still alive who came up with her. One of them held her hand, the same way she held mine when she was dying, and told me my grandmother was the best in her section, and that nobody ever thanked her for any of it. My voice was doing something I couldn't control. She wasn't a sad case, Mom. She wasn't a little person who never amounted to anything. She did something so important they made her promise to spend the rest of her life pretending she hadn't. And she kept the promise. She kept it through being broke, through being widowed, through her own daughter laughing at her. She kept it all the way to a hospital room where the only person who showed up was the one who happened to leave a phone number with a neighbor. My mother put her hand over her mouth. My father stared at the table. My brother was there too, hanging back the way he always did. He spoke up, and his voice cracked. She called me, he said. About 2 years ago. She wanted help moving a dresser, she said. Just a dresser. I told her I'd come by that weekend. I never went. I forgot. I never went. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. She never called me again. Nobody said anything for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside a car went by. Why didn't she just tell us? My mother whispered finally. Even a little. Even at the end. I would have... She stopped because I think she heard it as she said it, the shape of the answer. Because you never made it safe for her to, I said. As gently as I knew how, which wasn't very. She had one secret she was sworn to keep, and the rest of it she gave away by accident, a little at a time. Every year you treated her like she was nothing. She let you think the small version of her because the small version didn't cost anybody anything. The real one would have meant explaining the silence, and she couldn't, so she just let you have the easy story. My father put his face in his hands. "We didn't deserve her," he said into his palms. It was the truest thing I ever heard him say. For the first time in my life, I didn't argue with him. A month later, we held a second service. My idea, that they came to it on their own once it was suggested, wanted it, even in the awkward way of people who don't know how to put down guilt, and so they carry it somewhere useful. Not a military thing. There never could be one. The colonel told me that gently, and I understood. The whole point of her was that there was no record to drape a flag over, so we did something smaller and, I think, truer. We gathered at the cemetery on a clear Saturday in October. Me, my parents, my brother, the neighbor, the woman from her church, the retired mailman. Vivian Marsh's grandson drove her up from Richmond, and she sat in a folding chair in her cardigan with the wren pin and told 3 stories about a girl named Peg that made everyone laugh and then made everyone cry. There were no speeches about heroism. We told the human things. My father stood up, he hadn't planned to, and said he had spent his whole life sizing people up by what they had in the driveway, and that he had stood in a kitchen for 30 years across from one of the bravest people his country ever produced and seen nothing but a woman who made him uncomfortable. He couldn't finish. My mother held his arm. We did one more thing. My grandmother's house had sold. After the cost, there'd been a little money, and instead of splitting it the way my mother had once been so anxious to do, we put all of it, every dollar, into a fund at a national organization that helps elderly veterans who are living alone and slipping through the cracks. The exact kind of person she'd been, dying quietly in a town that forgot her. We did it in her name, but privately. No plaque. She'd have hated a plaque. She'd have swept right past it on her way to refill the coffee. I kept the coin. I went back to the cemetery alone, one more time, before I drove back to Kentucky. The maple seeds that used to fall on her porch don't reach the cemetery, but the trees there had turned and the light came down through them gold and ordinary. I knelt by the new headstone. My parents had paid for a proper one this time. It said her name and her dates, and underneath the line I'd asked for and they hadn't argued with, she kept faith with things she could not name. I held the coin in my palm and felt the little owl press into my skin. "I know who you were now," I said. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry it took all of us so long." The wind moved the leaves around and a few came down, and that was all. No sign, no answer. I didn't need one. I'd had 91 years of answer sitting in a folding chair in a cardigan an hour before, telling me my grandmother had been the best in her section and that I had her chin and her way of guarding a door. I think about her constantly now, in a way I never did when she was alive and sitting right there with her chipped mug and her swept porch. I think about how this country is full of people like her, old men at the end of the counter nursing a coffee, old women living alone with the heat turned down to save money. People who did enormous things and were sworn to small lives and kept the bargain without complaint. We walk past them every day. We decide they're nobody because they don't tell us they're somebody, and the ones who can't tell us are exactly the ones who earned the right to be heard the most. I'm still in the army. I still believe in the oath, in the structure, in doing the work whether or not anyone's watching. Maybe I believe in it more now, having met the cost of it up close. But something in me has reorganized itself around a different center. I used to think the measure of a life was what you could point to. Rank, recognition, the thing you put on the wall. My family raised me on that, and they're only now unlearning it. Late, the hard way, I don't believe it anymore. The measure of a life is what holds after you're gone, whether or not your name is attached to it. Somewhere out there are people who slept safe and never knew her name. Somewhere out there is a country that owes a quiet old woman in a steel town a debt it will never be able to record, let alone pay. So this is the only thing I know how to do about it. I'm telling you, and I'm asking you, the next time you sit down to dinner with your family, to look at the quiet one at the end of the table. The one who doesn't interrupt, who waves off the spotlight, who fixed something for you once and never mentioned it again, and ask them a real question, and then sit still long enough to hear the answer. Because someday the chair will be empty, and all you'll have is whatever you bothered to learn while they were still in it. I learnt mine a little too late to tell her to her face. Don't be like me. Don't be like the family I came from. Sit still. Listen, they're trying to hand you something they were never allowed to say out loud. For months after the funeral, I told myself my grandmother died alone because people are careless, because families drift, because that's just how it goes. It was easier than the real answer. The real answer was cause and effect, plain as anything once I let myself look at it. My mother decided early that a person was worth whatever they could put on display, and she passed that down to all of us without ever saying it out loud. So when Peg showed us nothing, we saw nothing. We made her small with our own eyes, and then we blamed her for being small. That was the chain, link by link, that ended in a county hospital room with only one chair occupied. What broke the chain wasn't luck. A colonel happened to see a brass coin, yes, but the coin only carried weight because Peg had spent 60 years refusing to throw it away, refusing to explain it, refusing to break a promise nobody was checking up on anymore. That's the first thing I carry now. She kept her word when keeping it cost her everything and earned her nothing. No thanks, no record, not even her own daughter's respect. I used to think character was how you behave when people are watching. She taught me it's the exact opposite. It's what you do in the years no one will ever audit. The second thing is harder to name. Vivian told me Peg could see the shape of a thing before anyone else had it half typed out. That wasn't magic. That was a mind she sharpened on purpose every day, in a hot building full of 5-digit groups, because she understood that paying close attention was itself a kind of service. I want that, not to be the cleverest person in the room, to be the one who actually looks, who reads what's in front of her, instead of the comfortable story she'd rather believe. My family believed the comfortable story about Peg for 30 years, and it cost us the only chance we'd ever get to know her. The third thing is the one that keeps me up. Peg carried a silence heavy enough to strain a marriage and thin out a friendship, and she carried it without bitterness for the whole rest of her life. She didn't get loud about her suffering. She just kept sweeping the porch. There's a kind of toughness that doesn't look like toughness at all, that looks like an old woman with a chipped mug, and it took me 29 years and a little brass owl to recognize it. So here's what I'd ask of you, whoever you are. Be the one who keeps faith when no one's keeping score. Train yourself to look harder than is comfortable, and learn to carry the heavy things quietly, the way Peg did, without making everyone around you pay for the weight. Do those 3, and you won't need a colonel to freeze in a banquet hall to know your life mattered. You'll already know it. And so will the people who sat still long enough to learn who you really were.